Deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where morning mist dances across forgotten streams, a young man named Caleb stands before the weathered remains of his grandfather's cabin. The structure leans precariously against time itself, its foundation stones scattered like broken promises along the riverbank. This isn't just any abandoned building, it's the last physical connection to the only family member who ever truly understood him. His grandfather, Samuel, had lived here for 40 years before passing away 6 months ago, leaving Caleb completely alone in the world. The old man had taught him everything about living off the land, about finding peace in solitude, about building something lasting with nothing but determination and skilled hands. Now, staring at the collapsed roof and rotting timbers, Caleb makes a decision that will transform both his life and this forgotten place. But will restoring this cabin heal the deep wounds of his past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of rushing water had been Caleb's alarm clock for the past 3 years. His makeshift shelter, built into a natural alcove upstream from the cabin ruins, offered protection from the elements but little comfort. Canvas stretched between sturdy oak trees, reinforced with salvaged metal sheeting and sealed with pine pitch, created a space barely large enough for his sleeping bag and essential supplies. It wasn't much, but it had kept him alive through harsh mountain winters and sweltering summers. This morning felt different. The air carried a crisp promise of autumn, and the leaves whispered secrets he was finally ready to hear. Caleb rolled from his sleeping bag and stepped outside, his bare feet finding familiar purchase on the smooth river stones. The water ran clear and cold, perfect for the brook trout that had sustained him through countless meals. But today, fishing could wait. The walk downstream to his grandfather's property took 15 minutes along a well-worn deer path. Samuel had shown him this route countless times during those precious childhood summers, back when Caleb's world still included parents and birthday parties, and the assumption that family would always be there. That was before the car accident when he was 12, before the foster homes that never quite fit, before Samuel finally stepped in to claim his grandson from a system that didn't understand wild boys who talked more to trees than people. Samuel's cabin came into view through the morning haze, looking even more forlorn than yesterday. The roof had completely collapsed on the eastern side, leaving exposed beams pointing toward the sky like broken ribs. The stone foundation, once perfectly level and square, now resembled a gap-toothed smile with missing pieces scattered down to the water's edge. Ivy and wild grapevines had claimed the southern wall, creating a green curtain that might have looked charming in a fairy tale, but spoke only of neglect in reality. Caleb approached slowly, reverently, the way he might approach a wounded animal. This place held more memories than any cathedral held prayers. Here, Samuel had taught him to identify edible plants, to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to understand that silence wasn't empty but full of important conversations most people never learned to hear. Here, they had spent long winter evenings by the fireplace, Samuel carving intricate figures from seasoned wood, while Caleb practiced the multiplication tables that seemed so irrelevant to mountain life. The front porch, once sturdy enough to hold both their weights during evening talks, now sagged dangerously. Caleb tested each board before putting his full weight down, remembering Samuel's constant reminders about respecting the materials that sheltered you. The heavy wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges, revealing an interior choked with debris and decades of accumulated leaves. Inside, shafts of sunlight pierced the gloom through gaps in the collapsed roof, illuminating a scene of beautiful destruction. Samuel's massive stone fireplace still dominated the main room, its chimney intact and reaching toward the sky with stubborn dignity. The hand-hewn log walls showed the skill of their creator, each piece carefully selected and fitted with the precision of a man who understood that shoddy work in the wilderness could mean death. Caleb's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and details emerged from the chaos. There, beneath a fallen beam, sat Samuel's favorite rocking chair, its rush seat rotted away but the frame still solid. The kitchen area retained its rustic charm despite the damage, with open shelving that had once held mason jars of preserved vegetables and wild honey. Samuel's wood-burning cook stove, a massive iron beast that had heated the entire cabin during winter months, sat buried under debris but likely still functional. Memory flooded back unbidden. Summer afternoons when Samuel would let him help with simple repairs, teaching him to respect the tools and understand that building something meant thinking 3 steps ahead of your current action. Evening meals prepared together on that old stove, the satisfaction of food earned through their own labor. Winter nights when the wind howled outside but the cabin stood firm, protecting them with walls built by Samuel's own hands 40 years ago. The old man had never been one for fancy speeches, but his lessons came through example and patient repetition. A man who can't build his own shelter, Samuel used to say, isn't really a man at all. He's just borrowing space from someone else's vision. At 18, when Caleb had stormed away from the mountain after a fight about college and responsibility and joining the real world, those words had seemed like criticism. Now they felt like prophecy. Caleb circled the ruins slowly, his trained eye cataloguing what could be saved and what would need replacing. The foundation stones were solid, quarried from the mountain itself, and laid with mathematical precision. Most of the wall logs were salvageable if he could clear away the damaged roof structure without further collapse. The floor joists looked sound, protected by the elevation Samuel had built into the design. This wasn't just a building project, this was archaeology of the heart, excavating not just broken timber and scattered stone, but the relationship that had shaped him more than any other. Samuel had been father, teacher, and guide all wrapped into one weathered frame. He had taken a broken 12-year-old boy and taught him that solitude wasn't loneliness, that simplicity wasn't poverty, that a man could be complete without needing anyone else's approval or assistance. As Caleb stood among the ruins, his hand instinctively reached for the walking stick, leaning against what remained of the porch railing. Samuel's hand-carved walking stick had somehow survived the years of neglect, its seasoned hickory as solid as the day his grandfather had finished it. The intricate carvings told the story of Samuel's life in the mountains, a bear representing the first wildlife encounter, an eagle for the day he'd climbed the highest peak, delicate wildflowers marking the spot where he'd met Caleb's grandmother, and near the handle a small figure of a boy learning to fish. Running his fingers over the familiar grooves, Caleb remembered the countless hours Samuel had spent perfecting each detail. Winter evenings by the fire, the old man's gnarled hands moving with surprising grace as thin wood shavings curled away from his carving knife. "Every mark tells a story," Samuel would explain. "Make sure your stories are worth telling." The walking stick had been Samuel's constant companion during their explorations. Together, they had mapped every game trail within a 10-mile radius, identified the best fishing holes, and located the hidden groves where wild apples and walnuts grew. Samuel used the stick to test the depth of streams, to part dense undergrowth, and occasionally to emphasize important points during their long conversations about life, responsibility, and what it meant to be a man. Caleb's throat tightened as he recalled their last argument, 6 months before Samuel's death. He had been 24 then, restless and feeling trapped by the mountain's isolation. The outside world beckoned with promises of excitement, advancement, and the kind of success that couldn't be measured in survival skills or self-sufficiency. Samuel had listened quietly to Caleb's plans to leave for the city, to find a real job, to build a life that made sense to other people. "This mountain has everything a man needs," Samuel had said finally, his weathered hand gripping the carved walking stick. "Food, shelter, peace, purpose. What more could you want?" "A future," Caleb had shot back, the words sharper than he'd intended. "Something that matters beyond just surviving day to day." Samuel's face had closed down then, the way it did when he was deeply hurt but too proud to show it. "Surviving matters, boy. Living matters. Building something with your own hands matters. All this other stuff you're chasing, it's just noise." They had stood in this very spot, the cabin solid and welcoming behind them, the river singing its eternal song, and Caleb had felt only the suffocating weight of expectations he couldn't meet. He had left the next morning without saying goodbye, carrying nothing but a backpack and the certainty that he was choosing freedom over limitations. The years that followed had taught him exactly how wrong he'd been. construction jobs in distant cities that lasted only as long as the weather held, cramped apartments shared with strangers who measured friendship in split utility bills, supervisors who cared only about speed and profit, never about the satisfaction of work done right. The constant noise of traffic, sirens, arguments and televisions that made real thinking impossible. When the call came about Samuel's death, Caleb had been working on a high-rise project in Charlotte, mixing concrete for a foundation he'd never see completed. The funeral had been small, attended mostly by people from the nearest town who remembered Samuel's rare trips to the general store. Tom Harrison, who ran the store, had been the one to call Caleb. "Your grandfather talked about you every time he came in," Tom had said after the service. "Never stopped believing you'd come home." Now, holding the walking stick and surrounded by the ruins of the only real home he'd ever known, Caleb understood what Samuel had been trying to tell him. This wasn't about hiding from the world or avoiding responsibility. This was about understanding what truly mattered, about building something that would last longer than a paycheck or a performance review. The walking stick felt right in his hand, perfectly balanced and worn smooth by years of use. As he gripped it, Caleb could almost feel Samuel's presence, could almost hear the old man's patient voice explaining the difference between existing and living. The carvings seemed to pulse with accumulated wisdom, each mark representing not just an event, but a choice to find meaning in simple things. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the surrounding peaks. Samuel had always said that hawks were messengers, bringing clarity to those wise enough to listen. Today, the message seemed clear. Some things were worth preserving, worth rebuilding, worth dedicating a life to maintaining. Caleb made his decision with the same quiet certainty Samuel had always displayed. The cabin would rise again, exactly as it had been, but stronger. And in rebuilding it, perhaps he could rebuild the part of himself that had been broken by years of searching for something that had been here all along. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting shifting shadows through the broken roof as Caleb began his methodical inspection of the cabin's remains. Each step revealed new details, new memories, new challenges that would need to be overcome. The floorboards, where they remained intact, still bore the scuff marks from Samuel's heavy work boots and the gentler impressions left by Caleb's bare feet during those long-ago summers. Near the eastern wall, partially buried under collapsed timber, Caleb spotted the corner of Samuel's old wooden trunk. With careful movements, he cleared away the debris, his hands working with the deliberate precision Samuel had taught him. Never rush, never force what didn't want to move. Always think 3 steps ahead of your current action. The trunk's brass corners were green with age, but the cedar construction had protected its contents from the worst of the weather. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, lay the treasures of Samuel's simple life. A collection of hand-forged fishing hooks, each one crafted during long winter evenings when the old man's arthritis made heavy work impossible. A leather pouch containing seeds saved from the best vegetables in his garden, each variety carefully labeled in Samuel's precise handwriting. Several books on wilderness survival and traditional building techniques, their pages yellowed but their knowledge still intact. At the bottom of the trunk, Caleb's fingers found a small wooden box he'd never seen before. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with dovetail joints so tight they seemed to flow together naturally. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a brass compass that must have belonged to Samuel during his younger years. The face was worn smooth by countless thumbs, and the needle still responded to magnetic north with unwavering accuracy. But it was the inscription on the back that stopped Caleb's breath entirely. To Samuel, may you always find your way home. Love, Margaret. His grandmother's name, spoken so rarely that it had taken on an almost mythical quality. Samuel had never talked much about her, only saying that she'd been the best part of his life and that losing her young had taught him to value every moment of happiness that came his way. Caleb turned the compass over in his palm, watching the needle settle into its eternal pointing. Home. The word carried weight now that it had never held during his restless years in the cities. Home wasn't just a place you slept or kept your belongings. Home was where your story lived, where the people who shaped you had walked the same paths and breathed the same air. The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted his reverie. Caleb looked up to see a figure approaching through the trees, moving with the careful gait of someone who understood mountain terrain. As the visitor came closer, Caleb recognized Tom Harrison from the funeral, though the man looked older and more weathered than he remembered. "Figured I might find you here," Tom called out, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of mountain folk. "Sarah spotted smoke from your camp this morning, and I put two and two together." Sarah. Caleb had a vague memory of a teenage girl hanging around the general store during his last visits with Samuel, all elbows and knees and serious dark eyes. She must be grown by now, probably married and moved away like most young people in these parts. "Mr. Harrison," Caleb acknowledged, standing and brushing the dust from his clothes. "Didn't expect to see anyone up here." "Tom," the older man corrected gently, "and this place draws people back, whether they expect it or not. Your grandfather always said this land had a way of calling to those who belonged here." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both men understanding the weight of memory that surrounded them. Tom's eyes took in the destruction with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen plenty of mountain cabins succumb to time and weather. "Lot of work ahead of you," Tom observed without judgment. "Yes, sir," Caleb agreed, "but Samuel built it once. I reckon I can build it again." Tom nodded approvingly. "He'd like that. Talked about you every time he came to the store, you know. Never stopped believing you'd find your way back to what mattered." The words hit harder than any accusation could have. Samuel's faith in him had survived their argument, survived years of silence, survived even death itself. The old man had known something Caleb was only beginning to understand, that some connections run deeper than disagreement, deeper than pride, deeper than the temporary blindness that makes young men think they know better than their elders. "I brought you something," Tom continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Been keeping it since the funeral, waiting for the right time." He pulled out a set of keys, their brass surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. Keys to the cabin and to the old truck Samuel kept in the shed behind the store. "Figured you might need transportation if you're serious about this restoration project." Caleb accepted the keys with hands that trembled slightly, the weight of them far greater than their physical mass. Samuel's truck represented independence, mobility, the ability to gather materials and supplies without relying on others. But more than that, it represented trust. Tom's faith that this project was more than just a young man's romantic notion about honoring the dead. "The truck's old but reliable," Tom continued. "Samuel kept it maintained even after he stopped driving much. Said it was important to have working tools even if you didn't use them every day." They walked together toward the river, their boots crunching on fallen leaves that spoke of autumn's approach. The water ran clear and fast over smooth stones, creating the constant music that had lulled Caleb to sleep for years. Here, where the cabin's foundation met the water's edge, Samuel had built a small dock for fishing and washing. The structure had mostly survived, its thick posts driven deep into the riverbed and anchored with stones that would outlast generations. "Your grandfather was particular about this spot," Tom said, settling onto a sun-warmed boulder. "Used to say the cabin had to sit just so close enough to the water for convenience, high enough to avoid spring floods, positioned to catch the morning sun, but stay cool in summer afternoons." Caleb nodded, remembering Samuel's careful explanations about choosing a building site. Every decision had multiple reasons, each consideration balanced against the others until the perfect solution emerged. The old man had taught him to think like the land itself, to understand how water moved, how wind flowed, how the sun traveled across the sky through different seasons. He talked about building codes too, Tom added with a slight smile. Said the mountain had its own codes that mattered more than what some government inspector might think. Build it right for the place you're in, not for some theoretical standard that might work in a city suburb. The observation struck home. During his years in construction, Caleb had watched crews slap together buildings that met minimum legal requirements but ignored common sense. Houses built in flood zones, roofs designed for mild climates installed in areas that saw heavy snow, materials chosen for cost rather than durability. Samuel's approach had been the opposite: overbuilt, oversized. designed to last centuries rather than decades. I remember helping him replace these dock planks, Caleb said, running his hand along the smooth-worn wood. Must have been the summer I turned 15. He made me sand each board 3 times, said if something was worth doing, it was worth doing right. Sounds like Samuel, Tom agreed. Man never did anything halfway. Sarah's the same way, drives me crazy sometimes, the way she'll redo something until it's perfect, but I suppose that's not the worst trait a person could have. The mention of Sarah sparked Caleb's curiosity. She's still around. I remember her being quite young when I left, 26 now, and stubborn as her mother was. Got herself a degree in environmental engineering, came back home despite all my efforts to convince her she could make more money in the city. Says the mountains need people who understand both the old ways and the new science. Environmental engineering. The combination intrigued Caleb more than he expected. Someone who understood both traditional mountain wisdom and modern conservation techniques might be exactly the kind of person who could appreciate what he was trying to accomplish with the cabin restoration. She works part-time at the store, part-time for the county doing water quality testing and erosion control projects, Tom continued. Smart as a whip, but she's got definite opinions about how things should be done. Your grandfather always said she reminded him of Margaret, sweet as honey most of the time, but immovable when she set her mind to something. The afternoon was growing late, shadows lengthening across the cabin ruins. Tom stood and stretched, his joints creaking with the sound of a man who'd spent decades doing physical work. I should head back before Sarah starts worrying. She's got supper planned, and she doesn't appreciate it when people are late to her table. Mr. Harrison, Tom, Caleb corrected himself. Thank you. For the keys, for coming up here, for everything. Samuel was a good friend, Tom replied simply. Good friends look out for each other's family, even when that family is too stubborn to ask for help. After Tom disappeared down the trail, Caleb remained by the river as darkness approached. The evening sounds of the mountains began their familiar chorus. Owl calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the eternal whisper of water over stone. This was the soundtrack of his childhood, the music that had shaped his dreams and taught him that silence wasn't empty, but full of conversation for those who knew how to listen. Standing in the ruins of his grandfather's life work, holding keys to a future he was only beginning to imagine, Caleb felt something shift inside him. The restless energy that had driven him away from the mountains was transforming into something more focused, more purposeful. Tomorrow, he would begin the real work. Tonight, he would sit by his small campfire and plan the resurrection of the only home that had ever truly mattered. Dawn came with the crisp clarity that only autumn mornings could provide. Caleb woke to the sound of his small campfire crackling back to life, the dry kindling catching quickly in the cool air. He had learned Samuel's method of banking coals overnight, covering them with ash to preserve the heat until morning. It was one of 1,000 small skills the old man had passed down, practical knowledge that made the difference between comfort and hardship in mountain living. After a breakfast of coffee and cornbread cooked on a flat stone over the fire, Caleb made his way down to the cabin ruins. The morning light revealed details that evening shadows had hidden, and he approached the work with Samuel's methodical patience. Clear the debris first, the old man would have said. You can't build on a foundation you can't see. The collapsed roof beam that had dominated the main room proved to be the key obstacle. Hand-hewn from a massive chestnut tree, it would have taken Samuel weeks to shape with traditional tools. The beam itself was still sound, but its weight had crushed everything beneath it when the supporting structure finally gave way. Moving it would require careful planning and probably some mechanical advantage. Caleb started with the smaller debris, working systematically from one corner of the room toward the center. Each piece of broken wood told part of the story of the cabin's decline. Some showed the clean breaks of structural failure, others the gradual decay of weather exposure. He sorted as he worked, creating piles of salvageable lumber, firewood, and material that was beyond saving. It was beneath a collapsed section of interior wall that he found Samuel's leather-bound journal, wrapped in oiled canvas and miraculously preserved from the worst of the moisture. The leather was supple still, darkened with age and handling but intact. Caleb's hands shook slightly as he unwrapped it, remembering the countless evenings when Samuel had made entries by lamplight, recording everything from weather patterns to philosophical observations about mountain life. The journal fell open to an entry dated just 3 months before Samuel's death. October 15th, first hard frost came early this year. The maples are showing their colors, and the deer are moving to winter feeding grounds. Found fresh bear sign near the apple grove, probably a sow with cubs preparing for hibernation. The cabin needs roof work before snow, but my hands aren't what they used to be. Maybe it's time to admit I can't do everything myself anymore. Caleb's throat tightened, reading his grandfather's matter-of-fact assessment of his declining abilities. Samuel had never been one to complain or seek sympathy, but the journal revealed the private struggles of an aging man trying to maintain a lifestyle that demanded physical strength and endurance. He flipped through pages at random, each entry offering glimpses into Samuel's solitary life. Weather observations, animal sightings, notes about which plants had produced well and which areas needed attention. But scattered throughout were more personal reflections that revealed the depth of Samuel's regret about their final argument. November 2nd. Dreamed about Caleb again last night. He was 12 years old, helping me split wood for winter. Woke up remembering how proud he looked when he finally managed to split a log clean through on his first swing. That boy had natural instincts for this life, but I pushed too hard, expected too much. Maybe I was trying to make him into me instead of letting him become himself. The words hit like physical blows. Samuel's private acknowledgement of his own mistakes, his recognition that love and control weren't the same thing, his understanding that he had driven away the person who mattered most to him. Caleb had to stop reading, the journal blurring through unexpected tears. He closed his eyes and let the mountain's silence wash over him. A gentle breeze stirred the remaining leaves overhead, creating the soft whisper that Samuel had always said was the mountains talking to those wise enough to listen. Slowly, Caleb opened the journal again and turned to the final entry, dated just 1 week before Samuel's death. March 18th. The heart specialist in town says I don't have long. Funny how knowing changes everything and nothing at the same time. The mountains look the same, the river sounds the same, but every sunrise feels different when you know there won't be too many more. I keep thinking about Caleb, wondering if he's happy wherever he ended up. Part of me hopes he stays away, builds a life that makes sense to other people. But another part keeps hoping he'll come home someday, see this place the way I see it, understand that some things matter more than progress or success or fitting in with the rest of the world. The entry continued in Samuel's careful script. If something happens to me before I can make things right with the boy, I hope he finds this journal. I hope he understands that I never stopped believing in him, never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping he'd find his way back to what really matters. This cabin, this land, this way of life. It's not about hiding from the world. It's about understanding what the world really needs, what people really need when you strip away all the noise and complications. Caleb's vision blurred again, but he forced himself to read the final paragraph. I built this place for Margaret, thinking we'd grow old here together. Raise children who understood the value of simple things. When she died, I almost abandoned it. Almost let grief drive me away from everything we'd dreamed about. But then young Caleb came to me, broken and angry and lost, and I realized the cabin had a new purpose. Not just as a home, but as a teacher. Every log, every stone, every carefully fitted joint was a lesson about patience, about quality, about building something that would last longer than the person who created it. If Caleb ever comes back, I hope he'll see those lessons and understand that this place was always meant to be his inheritance. The weight of Samuel's journal entries settled into Caleb's bones like winter cold, but instead of despair, he felt a growing sense of purpose. His grandfather's words had transformed the restoration from a memorial project into something deeper, a completion of conversations that death had interrupted, a bridge between the man Samuel had been and the man Caleb was becoming. He spent the rest of that morning clearing debris with renewed energy, each piece of salvaged wood now carrying the promise of resurrection rather than the burden of decay. The afternoon sun was warm on his shoulders as he worked, and for the first time in years, Physical labor felt like prayer rather than mere necessity. By evening, he had uncovered Samuel's old toolbox, its red paint faded to rust brown, but the contents still organized with military precision. Inside, wrapped in oiled rags, lay the hand tools that had built the original cabin. A draw knife for shaping logs, chisels of various sizes for fine work, a level with its brass fittings still bright, and a collection of hand planes that spoke of a time when craftsmanship mattered more than speed. Each tool felt perfectly balanced in Caleb's hands, worn smooth by decades of use, but maintained with the care Samuel brought to everything important in his life. The draw knife's edge was still sharp enough to shave paper, evidence that Samuel had continued maintaining his tools even when his arthritic hands could barely grip them. These weren't just implements, they were extensions of Samuel's skill and knowledge, waiting patiently for worthy hands to bring them back to useful life. The next morning brought Caleb's first trip to Tom's general store in over 6 years. The 20-minute drive down the winding mountain road in Samuel's old Ford pickup felt like traveling through time. The truck ran smoothly despite its age, its engine tuned with the same meticulous care Samuel had brought to everything mechanical. The cab smelled of motor oil, pine shavings, and the ghost of Samuel's pipe tobacco, creating an olfactory memory so powerful that Caleb could almost believe his grandfather sat beside him in the passenger seat. Harrison's general store occupied the same weathered building it had for 40 years, its wide front porch still lined with wooden chairs where old-timers gathered to discuss weather, politics, and the general decline of modern civilization. The bell above the door announced Caleb's arrival with the same cheerful chime he remembered from childhood visits with Samuel. Tom looked up from his inventory clipboard with a welcoming smile. "Caleb, didn't expect to see you so soon. How's the assessment going?" "Better than expected," Caleb replied, surprised by how natural the conversation felt. "Samuel kept his tools in perfect condition, and there's more salvageable lumber than I first thought. But I'm going to need supplies, nails, roofing materials, probably some new dimensional lumber for framing." "We can handle most of that," Tom said, making notes on his clipboard. "Might have to special order some things, but the basics are in stock. You planning to rebuild it exactly like it was?" Before Caleb could answer, the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor announced another presence. He turned to see a young woman emerging from the store's back office, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes bearing the kind of honest dirt that came from real work rather than fashion statements. This had to be Sarah, though she bore little resemblance to the gangly teenager he vaguely remembered. She moved with confident grace, her brown eyes taking in details with the sharp assessment of someone accustomed to solving problems. When she smiled, Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the store's pot-bellied stove. "You must be Caleb," she said, extending a hand roughened by outdoor work. "I'm Sarah. Dad's told me about your restoration project." Her handshake was firm, direct, the greeting of someone who judged people by their actions rather than their words. "Good to meet you, Sarah. Tom mentioned you have an engineering background." "Environmental engineering," she confirmed. "I specialize in sustainable building practices and watershed management. When Dad told me what you're planning, I have to admit I was curious. Not many people our age are interested in traditional construction methods." "Most people our age don't understand what those methods can teach," Caleb replied, then felt heat rise in his cheeks at how pretentious that must have sounded, but Sarah nodded thoughtfully rather than rolling her eyes. "Exactly. There's a reason buildings like your grandfather's cabin lasted decades while modern construction starts falling apart after 10 years. Traditional methods evolved through trial and error. Over generations they represent accumulated wisdom rather than cost-cutting shortcuts." Her understanding surprised him. Most people, especially those with college educations, seem to view traditional building techniques as quaint anachronisms rather than sophisticated solutions to environmental challenges. "I've been documenting some of the old cabins in the area," Sarah continued, photographing construction details, interviewing elderly residents about traditional techniques. "It's amazing how much knowledge is being lost as the older generation passes away." "Samuel always said the mountains were the best teacher," Caleb said. Build for the place you're in, not for some theoretical standard. Your grandfather was a wise man, Sarah replied. I wish I'd had more opportunities to talk with him about his building philosophy. The few conversations we had were fascinating. Tom had been listening with the satisfied expression of a man watching two of his favorite people discover they spoke the same language. Sarah's been after me to document some of the construction techniques the old-timers used. Maybe you two could collaborate her technical knowledge and your hands-on experience with Samuel's methods. The suggestion sparked something in both Sarah and Caleb, a shared excitement about preserving knowledge that was rapidly disappearing from the mountains. They spent the next hour walking through the store while Tom gathered supplies, their conversation flowing with the easy rhythm of people who had found unexpected common ground. The biggest challenge with traditional methods, Sarah explained as they examined different types of hardware, is that they require skills most modern builders don't have. Hand-shaping logs, understanding wood grain, knowing how different species behave in various weather conditions, it's like a lost language. Samuel used to say that every tree had its own personality, Caleb replied, running his fingers along a piece of rough-cut oak. He could look at a log and tell you exactly where it would want to go in a building, which end should face up, how it would move as it dried and settled. Sarah's eyes lit up with genuine interest. That's exactly the kind of intuitive knowledge that gets dismissed as superstition, but it's actually based on decades of observation and experience. Modern engineering is finally catching up to what traditional builders knew instinctively. As they talked, Tom loaded supplies into the truck bed, boxes of galvanized nails, rolls of tar paper, bundles of cedar shingles that would weather to the same silver gray as the surrounding trees. The materials represented a significant investment, but Tom waved away Caleb's offer of immediate payment. Samuel's credit was always good here, Tom said simply. Figure that extends to family. Pay me when the project's done, and you know what the final cost looks like. The generosity touched Caleb more than he could express. In the years since leaving the mountain, he had grown accustomed to relationships based on contracts and immediate exchanges. The idea that someone would extend trust based on family connection and shared history felt like stepping back into a world where handshakes still meant something. There is one thing I should mention, Tom added, his expression growing more serious. Had a fellow in here last week asking about property records for your grandfather's land. Well-dressed city type, said he represented some development company interested in riverfront parcels. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Development company? Seems there's been some interest in the area for vacation homes, maybe even a resort complex, Tom continued. Nothing concrete yet, but you should probably make sure your property rights are solid before you invest too much time and money in rebuilding. Sarah frowned. What kind of development are they talking about? That area is pretty sensitive ecologically, the river system, the old-growth forest patches, the wildlife corridors. Money talks louder than environmental concerns, Tom said with the weary tone of someone who had watched progress steamroll over common sense too many times. But like I said, it's just preliminary inquiries so far. Probably nothing to worry about immediately. But Caleb was already worrying. The thought of developers turning Samuel's beloved wilderness into another cookie-cutter vacation destination made his stomach clench with protective fury. This land had been Samuel's sanctuary, the place where he had chosen to live and die according to his own values, rather than society's expectations. The drive back up the mountain gave Caleb time to process both the positive energy of meeting Sarah and the troubling news about potential development pressure. The truck climbed steadily through forests that were beginning their autumn transformation, maple and oak leaves, painting the mountainsides in shades of gold and crimson that no human artist could replicate. Back at the cabin site, Caleb unloaded supplies with methodical care, stacking lumber where it would stay dry and organizing hardware in Samuel's old coffee cans. The physical work helped calm his mind, allowed him to focus on immediate tasks rather than abstract worries about future threats. As afternoon faded into evening, he began the process of gathering river stones for foundation repair. The work required both strength and judgment, selecting stones that would fit together properly, understanding how water and frost would affect different types of rock, building in a way that would last decades rather than years. Each stone had to be chosen carefully, tested for soundness, positioned to bear weight while allowing drainage. Samuel had taught him that stonework was like a three-dimensional puzzle where every piece affected every other piece. Rush the process, and the entire structure would eventually fail. Take time to do it right, and the foundation would outlast generations. Working by the river as shadows lengthened, Caleb found himself thinking about Sarah's enthusiasm for traditional building methods. Her combination of technical knowledge and genuine respect for old ways suggested someone who might understand what he was trying to accomplish. The project didn't have to be a solitary endeavor. Perhaps some knowledge was meant to be shared, some skills preserved through teaching rather than isolation. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his thoughts. Tom's pickup appeared through the trees, and both Tom and Sarah climbed out as Caleb straightened from his work. "Brought supper," Sarah called out, holding up a covered basket. "Figured you might be too busy to cook for yourself." The evening meal turned into something Caleb hadn't experienced in years, genuine fellowship around a shared table. Sarah had brought thick sandwiches made with Tom's homemade bread, along with mason jars of sweet tea and slices of apple pie that tasted like autumn itself. They sat on the cabin's old foundation stones, using flat rocks as plates, while the river provided background music to their conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Sarah began, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over them. "About documenting traditional building techniques. There's probably grant money available for that kind of cultural preservation project, especially if we can tie it to environmental sustainability." Caleb looked up from his sandwich, intrigued despite himself. "What kind of grants?" "The State Historical Society, maybe some federal programs through the National Endowment for the Arts. Traditional building methods are exactly the kind of disappearing cultural knowledge they're trying to preserve." Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious, her eyes bright with the possibility of turning academic interest into practical action. Tom nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would have liked that idea. He always said knowledge was meant to be shared, not hoarded." "But would anyone actually use the information?" Caleb asked. "I mean, it's easier and faster to just buy pre-manufactured materials and follow standard construction practices." "That's exactly the problem," Sarah replied. "Easier and faster isn't always better, especially when you consider long-term sustainability. Traditional methods use local materials, require less energy to implement, and produce buildings that last longer with less maintenance. From an environmental perspective, they're often superior to modern techniques." She pulled out her phone and showed them photos from her documentation project, close-up shots of log joints, stone foundations, and roof construction details that revealed the sophisticated engineering behind seemingly simple structures. "Look at this corner joint from the old Miller cabin," she said, enlarging one image. "No nails, no metal hardware, just wood shaped to fit wood. It's been holding that building together for 80 years, and it's still as tight as the day it was cut." Caleb examined the photo with professional interest. The joint showed the mark of someone who understood wood grain and structural forces, who had taken the time to create something that would improve with age rather than deteriorate. It was the kind of work Samuel had taught him to appreciate, though he'd never fully grasped its sophistication until now. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "most of the people who know how to cut joints like that are in their 70s or 80s. When they're gone, that knowledge disappears unless someone makes an effort to preserve it." The weight of responsibility settled on Caleb's shoulders. Samuel's skills represented not just personal knowledge, but cultural heritage that would die with him unless someone carried it forward. The cabin restoration wasn't just about honoring one man's memory, it was about preserving a way of life that modern society was rapidly abandoning. "I'd be willing to help document what I remember of Samuel's techniques," Caleb said slowly, "but I'm not sure how much I really absorbed. I was pretty young when he was teaching me, and I wasn't always the most attentive student." "You'd be surprised what you remember once you start working with your hands again," Tom observed. "Muscle memory is powerful sometimes. Your body knows things your mind thinks it's forgotten." As if to prove the point, Caleb found himself automatically adjusting his grip on his coffee cup to account for a chip in the rim that he hadn't consciously noticed. Small adaptations, Unconscious compensations. Perhaps Samuel's lessons had taken root deeper than he realized. "We could start with your cabin project," Sarah suggested. "Document each step of the restoration process, compare traditional methods with modern alternatives, measure things like thermal efficiency and structural durability. It would be a perfect case study." The idea appealed to Caleb more than he expected. Working alone had its satisfaction, but the prospect of sharing knowledge, of ensuring that Samuel's wisdom reached beyond this single project, added a dimension of purpose he hadn't anticipated. "There's another advantage," Tom added with a slight smile. "Having Sarah involved would give you access to her engineering expertise. Some of those old techniques work beautifully, but understanding why they work can help you adapt them to modern building codes and environmental standards." Sarah blushed slightly at her father's obvious matchmaking, but she didn't disagree with the practical aspects of his suggestion. "I do know the local building inspector pretty well. If we can demonstrate that traditional methods meet or exceed modern performance standards, getting permits shouldn't be a problem." As the evening deepened and the first stars appeared above the mountain ridges, they planned a collaboration that felt like the beginning of something larger than any of them had initially imagined. The cabin restoration would become a laboratory for testing old wisdom against new challenges, a bridge between Samuel's generation and whatever came next. When Tom and Sarah finally left for home, Caleb sat alone by his campfire, listening to the night sounds of the mountains and thinking about unexpected partnerships. For the first time since returning to the mountain, he didn't feel entirely alone with his project. The work ahead would still be difficult, but it no longer felt impossible. The following morning brought the kind of clear, crisp weather that made mountain work a pleasure rather than a chore. Caleb woke before dawn, built up his fire, and prepared coffee in Samuel's old percolator, a ritual that connected him to countless mornings when his grandfather had performed the same simple ceremony. As the sun crested the eastern ridge, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Caleb began the day's work with renewed purpose. The foundation repair demanded careful attention, each stone selected and positioned with an understanding that this base would determine everything that followed. Samuel's original work provided a template, but 40 years of settling and frost heave had shifted some stones out of alignment. Working methodically, Caleb removed the displaced stones and excavated down to solid earth. The original foundation had been built on bedrock where possible, but in places Samuel had created a gravel base that allowed for drainage while providing stable support. The engineering was simple but sophisticated, based on an understanding of how water and frost affected different materials over time. By mid-morning, Sarah arrived with a notebook, camera, and measuring tape. She had traded her store clothes for work gear, sturdy jeans, steel-toed boots, and a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen plenty of honest labor. Her hair was braided back in a practical style that wouldn't interfere with detailed work. "I hope you don't mind," she said, showing him her equipment. "I brought some documentation tools. Thought we might start recording the process right from the foundation work." "I'd appreciate the help," Caleb replied honestly. "Samuel used to say that teaching something forced you to understand it better yourself." They worked together through the morning, Sarah taking detailed measurements and photographs, while Caleb explained Samuel's foundation techniques. The process of articulating what he was doing helped clarify his own understanding of the work. Principles that had seemed mysterious when he was younger began to make perfect sense when viewed through adult eyes. "Your grandfather really understood soil mechanics," Sarah observed, examining the gravel drainage system Samuel had installed beneath the foundation stones. This design would meet modern engineering standards for preventing frost, heave, and water damage. "He said the mountain taught him everything he needed to know," Caleb replied, setting another stone in place with careful attention to its orientation. "Watch how the water moves, understand how the ground freezes, build accordingly." Sarah nodded, making notes in her precise handwriting. Traditional builders were empirical scientists, whether they realized it or not. They tested hypotheses through trial and error, kept what worked, discarded what failed. The knowledge they accumulated was just as valid as what we develop in laboratories. The observation struck Caleb as profoundly true. Samuel's methods weren't primitive or outdated. They were time-tested solutions, developed through generations of practical experience. Modern building science was finally catching up to principles that mountain craftsmen had understood intuitively for decades. Around noon, they took a break for lunch, sitting on the completed section of foundation and sharing sandwiches Sarah had brought from the store. The view from the cabin site encompassed the entire valley, with the river winding through stands of hardwood that were reaching peak autumn color. "I can see why your grandfather chose this spot," Sarah said, following his gaze across the landscape. "Perfect southern exposure for solar gain, protected from prevailing winds, close enough to water for convenience, but high enough to avoid flooding. He used to say the land told him where to build," Caleb replied. "I thought that was just old-fashioned mysticism, but now I understand he was talking about reading environmental cues that most people ignore." Sarah smiled. "Some of the most sophisticated site analysis I learned in engineering school was just formal ways of describing what traditional builders did intuitively. Passive solar orientation, natural ventilation patterns, drainage management. Your grandfather incorporated all of that without ever taking a single engineering course." The afternoon brought unexpected challenges as they worked to level and square the foundation. Some of Samuel's original measurements had been affected by decades of settling, requiring adjustments that maintained structural integrity while preserving the aesthetic proportions that made the cabin feel right in its landscape. "This is the part that can't be taught from books," Caleb explained as he adjusted a cornerstone for the fourth time. "You have to feel when something is right, trust your eye and your hands more than your measuring tools." Sarah watched intently as he made minute adjustments, understanding that she was witnessing knowledge that could only be transmitted through direct observation and practice. Her engineering training gave her the vocabulary to describe what Caleb was doing, but his hands possessed wisdom that no classroom could provide. By evening, they had completed the foundation repair and begun planning the next phase of construction. The work had created a partnership that felt natural and productive, combining Sarah's analytical approach with Caleb's intuitive understanding of traditional methods. As Sarah prepared to leave, she turned back to survey their day's accomplishment. "This is going to be something special, isn't it? Not just a restored cabin, but a bridge between old wisdom and new understanding." Caleb nodded, feeling the truth of her words. What had begun as a personal memorial was evolving into something larger, a demonstration that the best of the past could inform and improve the future. October arrived with a symphony of color that transformed the mountainside into a living masterpiece. The sugar maples blazed orange and red against the deep green of pine and hemlock, while yellow birch leaves danced in the cool breeze like scattered coins. Caleb had forgotten how magnificent autumn could be in the mountains, how the changing seasons seemed to concentrate all of nature's artistry into a few perfect weeks. The foundation work had taken 2 weeks to complete properly, but the solid stone base now provided a platform that would support whatever structure rose above it. Following Samuel's original design, Caleb began laying the sill logs that would form the base of the walls. Each log had to be carefully selected, shaped, and positioned to create a level, square foundation for everything that followed. Working with hand tools required patience that modern construction schedules didn't allow. The draw knife that had shaped the original cabin moved across each log with the slow rhythm of meditation, removing bark and irregularities to create surfaces that would fit together perfectly. Caleb found himself falling into the same methodical approach Samuel had taught him: measure twice, cut once, and never rush work that was meant to last decades. Sarah had become a regular presence at the work site, arriving most mornings with coffee and fresh documentation supplies. Her engineering background allowed her to appreciate the sophisticated joinery techniques that traditional builders used to create structures without nails or metal fasteners. More importantly, her enthusiasm for the project had transformed solitary work into collaborative learning. "The precision is incredible," she observed, watching Caleb use Samuel's handplane to true the surface of a sill log. "Modern framing lumber is standardized to rough dimensions, but this is custom-fitted to exact specifications." "Samuel used to say that logs were like people," Caleb replied, checking his work with a level. Each one has its own personality, its own strengths and weaknesses. The trick is understanding how to work with what you have rather than forcing everything into the same mold. It was during the second week of wall construction that Sarah made an unexpected discovery. While Caleb worked on notching the corner joints, she had been photographing details of the original foundation when she noticed something tucked beneath one of the larger stones, a small wooden box, wrapped in oiled canvas and wedged into a crevice that had protected it from weather. "Caleb," she called out, her voice carrying a note of excitement, "I think you need to see this." The box was about the size of a jewelry case, crafted from what looked like walnut, with simple but elegant proportions. The wood had aged to a rich chocolate brown, and the craftsmanship spoke of patient hours spent with hand tools and sandpaper. When Caleb opened the hinged lid, he found himself looking at a faded photograph mounted in a silver frame. The image showed a young couple standing in front of the cabin when it was newly built. The man was clearly Samuel, perhaps 40 years younger, his arm around a woman with gentle eyes and dark hair pulled back in the fashion of the 1950 seconds. Both wore the simple clothes of people who valued function over fashion, and their expressions conveyed the quiet happiness of those who had found exactly what they were looking for in life. "That must be Margaret," Sarah said softly, understanding the significance of the discovery immediately. Caleb studied the photograph with the intensity of someone examining a religious artifact. He had seen only one picture of his grandmother before, a formal portrait that Samuel kept on his dresser. This informal image captured something different, the joy of a couple who had built something together, who shared a vision of how life could be lived. Beneath the photograph lay a folded piece of paper, the writing faded but still legible in Samuel's careful script. "Margaret, this cabin was built with my hands but designed by your heart. Every log was chosen with you in mind, every room planned for the life we would share here. If something happens to me before our time together is complete, know that you made this place sacred just by believing it could exist. All my love, Samuel." The letter was dated 3 months before Margaret's death, suggesting that Samuel had hidden it as a surprise that circumstances never allowed him to reveal. Reading it now, 40 years later, Caleb felt the weight of love that had survived death, of devotion that had shaped every aspect of the cabin's construction. "He really loved her," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than anything," Caleb agreed. "After she died, he used to say that the cabin was his way of keeping her memory alive. Every repair he made, every improvement he added, it was like continuing a conversation with her." The discovery reframed the restoration project in ways that neither Caleb nor Sarah had anticipated. This wasn't just about honoring Samuel's legacy, it was about preserving a love story that had been built into the very structure of the building. The careful attention to detail, the quality of craftsmanship, the way every element had been chosen and positioned with such care, all of it spoke of a man building a shrine to the woman who had given his life meaning. Working with renewed purpose, they spent the afternoon fitting the next course of logs, each joint cut with the precision that Samuel's love for Margaret had demanded. The work felt different now, weighted with the understanding that they were not just rebuilding a structure but resurrect. The photograph became a talisman of sorts, propped against a mason jar on the makeshift workbench, where both Caleb and Sarah could see it as they worked. Margaret's gentle smile seemed to watch over their efforts, a reminder that the cabin had been conceived in love and should be restored with the same careful devotion. As the walls rose log by log, Sarah began sharing more of her own story. Her mother had died when Sarah was 16, leaving her and Tom to navigate the difficult transition from family to partnership in grief. The general store had been her mother's passion project, a way of serving the mountain community while preserving the kind of personal relationships that chain stores couldn't replicate. "After Mom died, I threw myself into academic achievement," Sarah explained during a lunch break, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee to ward off the October chill. "Thought if I could just get far enough away, get enough education, accomplish enough professionally, the hurt would eventually fade." Caleb nodded, understanding the impulse to run from pain. "Did it work?" "For a while. I had a good job in Raleigh, working for an environmental consulting firm. Decent salary, nice apartment, all the markers of success that everyone said I should want. She paused, watching a hawk circle overhead. But I kept dreaming about these mountains, about the sound of the river, about conversations with my mother that I'd never get to finish. The parallel to his own experience wasn't lost on Caleb. Both of them had tried to escape the weight of loss by pursuing lives that looked successful from the outside but felt hollow at the core. Both had eventually been drawn back to the mountains by forces stronger than ambition or convenience. "What brought you home?" he asked. "Dad's heart attack 2 years ago. Nothing serious, but it made me realize that he wouldn't be around forever, that the store and everything it represented would disappear if someone didn't step up to preserve it." Sarah smiled ruefully. "Turns out you can't run away from the things that matter most. They just wait patiently for you to come to your senses." That afternoon, as they worked on notching a particularly challenging corner joint, Sarah's observations about traditional building techniques began to merge with more personal reflections about community and continuity. The cabin represented something that modern society had largely abandoned: the idea that some things were worth doing slowly, carefully, with attention to quality rather than efficiency. Every cut you make, every joint you fit, it's like you're having a conversation with your grandfather, she observed, watching Caleb test the fit of a new log. The building becomes a repository of knowledge and values, not just a place to live. Samuel used to say that a well-built cabin would teach the next generation, even if no one was left to explain the lessons. Caleb replied, adjusting his technique based on how the wood was responding to his tools. "The joinery shows you how to think about structural problems. The proportions teach you about harmony and balance." As October progressed, their working relationship deepened into something that felt increasingly essential to both of them. Sarah's technical knowledge complemented Caleb's intuitive understanding of traditional methods, while her emotional intelligence helped him process the complex feelings that the restoration project had awakened. The work itself became a form of therapy, each day's progress providing tangible evidence that broken things could be made whole again, that patient effort could overcome even significant damage. The walls rose steadily, each course of logs bringing the structure closer to the point where it would once again provide shelter and comfort. But the physical work was only part of what was happening at the cabin site. As autumn deepened and the mountains prepared for winter, Caleb found himself looking forward to Sarah's arrival each morning, almost as much as he anticipated the satisfaction of the day's construction tasks. Her presence had transformed the restoration from a solitary act of mourning into a collaborative celebration of life and possibility. The change didn't escape Tom's notice during his occasional visits to check on their progress. He observed the easy communication between them, the way they had developed an unspoken understanding about work rhythms and shared responsibilities. "Your grandfather would approve," Tom told Caleb one evening as they examined the day's work. "He always said that the best partnerships were built on shared values and mutual respect." "We work well together," Caleb admitted, though he sensed that Tom was referring to something deeper than construction collaboration. "Sarah's mother used to say that some people are meant to find each other," Tom continued with the careful neutrality of a father who wanted to offer wisdom without seeming to interfere. "Life has a way of bringing the right people together when they're ready to appreciate what they've found." That night, sitting by his campfire and listening to the river's eternal conversation with the stones, Caleb acknowledged what he had been trying not to think about too directly. His feelings for Sarah had evolved beyond partnership and friendship into something that both excited and terrified him. The prospect of building a life with someone who understood his values and shared his vision felt like a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. But the photograph of Samuel and Margaret served as a reminder that love and loss were inseparable, that opening himself to caring deeply also meant accepting the possibility of profound pain. The question was whether the risk was worth the reward, whether the chance of building something beautiful together justified the vulnerability that love demanded. The first serious test of their partnership came during the 3rd week of October, when an early winter storm swept down from Canada with unexpected fury. Caleb woke to the sound of sleet hammering against his canvas shelter, driven by winds that bent the surrounding trees at alarming angles. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight, and the half-completed cabin walls offered little protection for the construction materials that lay exposed to the elements. Sarah arrived at the worksite despite the dangerous driving conditions, her truck sliding slightly on the steep gravel road that led down to the cabin. She found Caleb struggling to cover the exposed lumber with tarps that the wind kept tearing from his hands. "This is crazy," she shouted over the howling wind. "We should wait until it passes." "Can't," Caleb called back, fighting to secure a corner of the tarp. "If this wood gets soaked and then freezes, it could split or warp beyond use." Without further argument, Sarah grabbed the other end of the tarp, and together they managed to create a makeshift shelter that would protect the most vulnerable materials. The work required them to move in perfect coordination, anticipating each other's actions and communicating through gestures when the wind made speech impossible. The storm lasted 18 hours, during which they took turns monitoring the tarps and making repairs when the wind worked loose, their improvised anchoring system. By the time the weather cleared, both were exhausted, soaked, and chilled to the bone despite their best efforts to stay dry. But something important had happened during those difficult hours. Working together under pressure had revealed depths of character that casual conversation couldn't have uncovered. Sarah's determination to protect the project despite personal discomfort, her willingness to trust Caleb's judgment about priorities, her grace under pressure, all of it spoke to the kind of partnership that could weather more than just mountain storms. "We make a good team," Caleb said as they surveyed the damage the next morning. Several smaller pieces of lumber had been blown around despite their efforts, and the worksite looked like a battlefield, but the critical materials had survived intact. "Better than good," Sarah replied, wringing water from her work gloves. "I can't remember the last time I felt so completely in sync with another person." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than either had intended but impossible to take back. They worked in thoughtful silence that morning, each processing the implications of what had been revealed during the storm. As November approached and the walls neared completion, their conversation began to include more personal topics. Sarah talked about her dreams of combining traditional building techniques with modern environmental science, perhaps starting a consulting business that could help preserve mountain culture while meeting contemporary sustainability standards. Caleb found himself sharing plans he hadn't even fully articulated to himself, ideas about expanding the cabin restoration into a larger demonstration of sustainable living, maybe offering workshops for people who wanted to learn traditional skills. The mountains could become a classroom rather than just a retreat, a place where old wisdom met new challenges. "We could document everything," Sarah suggested, her eyes bright with possibility. "Not just the building techniques, but the whole philosophy behind this way of life. Show people that simple doesn't mean primitive, that sustainability isn't about sacrifice, but about understanding what really matters." The collaboration had evolved beyond the restoration project into a shared vision of how they might build a life together. Neither spoke directly about romance, but the attraction was evident in the way they moved around each other, the lingering touches when passing tools, the way conversations continued long after the workday officially ended. It was during one of these extended evening discussions that Sarah made a discovery that would complicate everything they had been building together. While organizing some of Samuel's papers that Tom had brought from storage, she came across a folder marked Property Records that contained documents neither she nor Caleb had seen before. "Caleb," she said, her voice tight with concern, "I think we need to look at this together." The folder contained correspondence between Samuel and a law firm in the state capital, dated just 2 months before his death. The letters revealed that the property ownership situation was more complex than anyone had realized. Samuel had been paying what he thought were property taxes for 40 years, but the payments had actually been going to a management company that handled properties for absentee owners. The real owners, according to the documents, were the heirs of a lumber company that had purchased large tracts of mountain land in the 1942nd. Most of the family had moved to other states and had little interest in the remote parcels, but recent market pressures had motivated them to begin liquidating assets. "It gets worse," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. There's a letter here from the same development company Tom mentioned. They've already contacted the legal owners about purchasing this entire watershed for a resort development. The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. Everything he had been working toward, all the hopes and plans that had been taking shape, suddenly stood on a foundation as unstable as the original cabin had been. The restoration project that had seemed like a path toward healing and new beginnings might instead be a futile gesture, a sandcastle built below the high tide line. But looking at Sarah's stricken expression, seeing how the discovery had affected her almost as deeply as it had affected him, Caleb realized that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. The discovery of the property documents cast a shadow over everything they had accomplished, but Caleb surprised himself by feeling more determined rather than defeated. Perhaps it was the weeks of physical work that had rebuilt his confidence, or maybe it was Sarah's unwavering support, but the threat to the project only clarified how much it had come to mean to both of them. "We need to talk to Tom," Sarah said, gathering the papers with careful precision. "He might know more about the property history than he's mentioned." They found Tom at the store, reconciling the day's receipts with the methodical attention he brought to all business matters. When they spread the documents across his counter, his expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the implications of what Samuel had discovered just before his death. "I wondered why Samuel seemed so worried those last few months," Tom said finally. "He kept asking questions about property records, about how to research land ownership. I thought maybe he was considering selling, trying to figure out what the place might be worth." "Did he ever mention the development company?" Caleb asked. "Not directly, but there were rumors. People in town started talking about surveyors being seen up in the watershed, about outsiders asking questions at the county courthouse." Tom rubbed his forehead wearily. "I should have paid more attention, should have asked Samuel directly what was bothering him." Sarah had been studying the legal correspondence with the sharp focus she brought to technical problems. "The good news is that Samuel had been researching his options. It looks like he was exploring something called adverse possession, the idea that 40 years of continuous occupation and improvement might give him legal claim to the property." "Squatters' rights?" Caleb asked. "More sophisticated than that, but similar principle," Sarah explained. "If someone occupies land openly, continuously, and without permission for a certain period in this state, it's 20 years they can potentially claim legal ownership even without a deed." Tom's expression brightened slightly. Samuel was nothing if not thorough. If he thought there was a legal path forward, he probably documented everything carefully. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the cabin site. Caleb was working on fitting the plates that would support the roof structure when a black SUV with tinted windows navigated the rough road down to the Riverside. A man in an expensive suit emerged, looking profoundly out of place among the autumn leaves and construction debris. "Mr. Thornton?" the visitor called out, consulting a tablet as he picked his way carefully across the uneven ground. "I'm David Mitchell from Pinnacle Development Group. I believe we need to talk." Sarah appeared from behind the cabin where she had been photographing joinery details, her camera still in hand and her expression wary. Something about Mitchell's presence felt invasive, as if his very arrival had contaminated the sacred space they had been creating together. "I understand you've been doing some renovation work here," Mitchell continued, his tone suggesting polite interest, while his eyes assessed everything with calculating precision. "Impressive craftsmanship, though I'm afraid it may be wasted effort." "How so?" Caleb replied, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "This property is under contract for purchase by my clients. The current owners have accepted our offer, and we expect to close within 60 days. Any improvements made after that point would be the responsibility of the new owners." Mitchell's smile was professionally courteous but utterly without warmth. "And what do your clients plan to do with the land?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew and didn't like the answer. "Luxury vacation homes, primarily. The riverfront location is perfect for high-end cabins that would appeal to affluent buyers looking for mountain retreats. Of course, the existing structure would need to be demolished to make way for something more suitable to our target market." The casual dismissal of Samuel's life work, the reduction of 40 years of careful stewardship to an obstacle requiring demolition, hit Caleb like a physical assault. Everything he had been working toward, all the love and memory and hope that the restoration represented, would be erased to make room for vacation homes that would sit empty most of the year. "This cabin has historical significance," Sarah said, her engineer's training helping her maintain professional composure despite her obvious anger. "It represents traditional building techniques that are rapidly disappearing from the region." Mitchell's expression suggested he found such concerns charmingly naive. "I'm sure it does, but our market research indicates that buyers prefer modern amenities and contemporary design. Authenticity is nice in theory, but comfort and convenience sell properties." After Mitchell left, promising to return with official notice once the sale was finalized, Caleb and Sarah stood in the shadow of the half-completed walls and contemplated the magnitude of what they were facing. The legal battle would be expensive and uncertain, with no guarantee that Samuel's 40 years of occupation would be sufficient to establish ownership rights. But looking at the careful joinery they had created together, feeling the solid weight of the walls that rose from Samuel's original foundation, Caleb knew that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. The cabin represented more than shelter. It was a testament to values that couldn't be bought or sold, to the possibility that simple things done well could outlast the temporary fashions of any particular era. The envelope arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail to Tom's store, since the cabin site had no official address. Sarah signed for it with trembling hands, recognizing the return address of the law firm that had been corresponding with Samuel. Inside, a single document changed everything they thought they knew about the property situation. The deed was yellowed with age, bearing the official seal of the county recorder and dated 1943. But it wasn't made out to the lumber company heirs, as the recent correspondence had suggested. Instead, the property had been deeded to Samuel Harrison Thornton, his heirs and assigns, in consideration of military service and wounds received in defense of the United States of America. Sarah stared at the document in disbelief, then carefully examined the attached letter from Samuel's attorney. The explanation was complex but devastating in its implications. Samuel had indeed owned the land legally, but a clerical error in the county records had listed him as a tenant rather than an owner. For 40 years, he had been paying property taxes on land he already owned, while the lumber company had been collecting what they believed were legitimate lease payments from their management company. "This changes everything," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Samuel owned the property, then Caleb inherited it automatically. The development company's purchase contract is worthless." But Tom's expression remained troubled as he studied the documents. If it's that simple, why didn't Samuel's attorney contact Caleb after the funeral? Why let this legal mess continue for 6 months? The answer lay in a second letter, dated just 1 week after Samuel's death. The attorney who had been handling Samuel's affairs had died suddenly of a heart attack, and his small practice had been dissolved. Samuel's files had been boxed up and stored in a warehouse, waiting for someone to claim them or for the estate to be probated. Samuel never filed a will, Sarah realized, understanding the implications immediately. Without clear documentation of ownership and inheritance, the property has been in legal limbo. Anyone could have made a claim during this period. The discovery should have been cause for celebration, but instead it filled Caleb with a deep sense of unease. Legal ownership was one thing, but proving that ownership in court against well-funded developers would be another matter entirely. The deed was genuine, but 40 years of bureaucratic confusion had created a paper trail that could be challenged by expensive lawyers with unlimited time and resources. "We need to get this recorded immediately," Tom said, his practical mind cutting through the emotional complexity of the situation. "File the deed, establish clear title, make it official before the development company realizes what's happened." But even as they made plans to visit the county courthouse, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. Samuel had been too careful, too thorough, to let such an important document remain hidden if he had known about its existence. The timing of its discovery, just as the development pressure reached a crisis point, felt almost too convenient to be coincidental. Sarah was studying the deed with her engineer's attention to detail when she noticed something that made her breath catch. "Caleb, look at the signature on this deed. Look at it carefully." The signature read, Samuel H. Thornton, in the flowing script typical of the 1940 seconds. But there was something about the handwriting that seemed familiar. Caleb had seen that particular formation of letters before, in a context that made his stomach clench with sudden understanding. "It's the same handwriting as the entries in Samuel's journal," he said slowly. "This deed wasn't signed in 1943. Samuel created it himself, probably in the weeks before he died." The realization hit them like a physical blow. Samuel hadn't discovered proof of ownership, he had manufactured it, using his knowledge of legal documents and his access to official seals through his work as a volunteer with the County Historical Society. The deed was a forgery, created by a desperate man who was trying to protect his life's work from forces beyond his control. "He knew," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. "He knew about the development pressure, knew that his legal position was weak, and he decided to fight back the only way he could. The forgery was skillful enough to fool casual inspection, but it would never survive the kind of scrutiny that a court challenge would bring. Handwriting analysis, paper dating, ink composition, modern forensic techniques would expose Samuel's deception within days of any serious legal examination. So we're back to square one," Caleb said, sinking onto the store's front porch steps. "Worse than square one, actually, because now we're holding evidence of document fraud." But Tom was studying the situation with the kind of strategic thinking that had kept his store profitable through decades of economic ups and downs. "Maybe not," he said slowly. "Samuel was clever, but he wasn't a criminal. He wouldn't have risked forgery unless he believed he had some legitimate claim to the property." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "Think about it. Samuel spent months researching this situation before he died. He must have found something that convinced him he had rights to the land, something that justified the extreme step of creating false documentation." Tom's eyes had taken on the sharp focus he brought to complicated business problems. "We need to retrace his research, find out what he discovered that made him so desperate to establish ownership." The plan meant more time in county archives, more hours poring over dusty records and bureaucratic correspondence. But it also meant hope that Samuel's actions had been motivated by more than simple desperation, that somewhere in the maze of property law and historical documentation lay genuine justification for his claim to the land. As they locked up the forged deed in Tom's store safe, Caleb found himself thinking about the fine line between justice and law, between what was right and what was legal. Samuel had devoted 40 years to improving and protecting a piece of mountain wilderness, had created habitat for wildlife, and preserved traditional knowledge that was rapidly disappearing from the modern world. The developers would strip away that stewardship in a matter of months, replacing careful conservation with profitable exploitation. From a purely legal standpoint, they had every right to do so. But from the perspective of what the land needed, what the community needed, what future generations needed, Samuel's forgery began to seem less like fraud and more like an act of moral courage. The county courthouse occupied a grand stone building that had been imposing when it was built in 1892 and had only grown more intimidating with age. Sarah and Caleb climbed the worn marble steps on a grey November morning, carrying folders full of documents and a determination that felt fragile in the face of bureaucratic complexity. The records clerk, a woman in her 60s who had probably processed thousands of property disputes, listened to their request with professional patience. When they explained that they were researching the ownership history of Samuel Thornton's property, her expression shifted to something approaching sympathy. "Oh, that old mess," she said, shaking her head. "I remember when Mr. Thornton came in here a few months back, asking the same questions. Spent 3 days going through files, took notes on everything. Nice old gentleman, very polite, but he seemed quite upset about what he was finding." She led them to a basement room lined with filing cabinets that contained decades of property records, tax assessments, and legal correspondence. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows over documents that told the story of how land changed hands, how ownership was established and challenged, and sometimes lost entirely to legal technicalities. "Your grandfather was particularly interested in the military land grants," the clerk explained, pulling out a thick folder marked Veterans Administration Property Awards 1,940 to 1,950. Apparently there was a program after the war to grant land to veterans who had been severely wounded in sublime combat. Sarah opened the folder with careful hands, revealing documents that painted a picture of government bureaucracy attempting to honor military service while struggling with the practical complexities of land distribution. The program had been well-intentioned but poorly managed, with overlapping jurisdictions and incomplete record-keeping that had created decades of confusion. "Here," Caleb said, pointing to a form buried deep in the file. "Application for land grant, Samuel Harrison Thornton, Corporal, 82nd Airborne Division." The application was dated August 1943, just 2 months after Samuel had been wounded during the invasion of Sicily. The medical report attached to his file made for sobering reading: shrapnel wounds to his left leg and back, injuries severe enough to earn him a medical discharge, and a Purple Heart. The land grant was intended as compensation for his sacrifice, a way of giving wounded veterans a chance to build new lives after the war. But the file also contained a rejection letter stamped in red ink and dated 6 months later. Application denied. Selected property already under federal lease agreement with Consolidated Timber Corporation. Applicant advised to select alternative tract from approved list. So Samuel did have a legitimate claim, Sarah said, her voice tight with excitement. The government promised him this land as compensation for his war wounds, then reneged on the promise because of a technicality. But Caleb was studying the dates more carefully, and what he found chilled his optimism. "Look at this, Sarah. The rejection is dated February 1944, but Samuel didn't move to the mountain until 1945. If he knew his application had been denied, why did he come here anyway?" The answer lay in a folder labeled Consolidated Timber Corporation Federal Lease Agreements, which revealed a story of corporate influence and government corruption that explained why Samuel's land grant application had been denied. The timber company had obtained sweeping lease agreements for vast tracts of mountain land, but many of the contracts had been backdated to appear older than they actually were. A handwritten note in the margin of one document, signed by someone whose name had been scratched out, told the real story. CTC lease agreement dated 1940 but actually executed 1944. Federal land grants take precedence over corporate leases when grants predated lease agreements. Recommend denial of all veteran applications to avoid legal complications. Samuel found evidence of fraud, Sarah whispered, understanding the implications immediately. The timber company bribed officials to backdate their lease agreements so they would appear to predate the veteran land grants. The discovery reframed everything they thought they knew about Samuel's situation. He hadn't been squatting on land that belonged to someone else. He had been occupying property that had been stolen from him through corporate corruption and government malfeasance. His forged deed wasn't fraud. It was an attempt to reclaim what had been rightfully his from the beginning. But proving that claim would require more than decades-old documents with suspicious handwritten notes. They needed testimony from people who had been involved in the original transactions, evidence that could stand up to the kind of legal challenge that Pinnacle Development Group could afford to mount. "Most of the people who were involved in this are probably dead," Caleb said, voicing the discouraging reality they both understood. "Even if we can prove the original land grant was legitimate, establishing current ownership after 40 years of bureaucratic confusion won't be simple." Sarah had been photographing documents with systematic thoroughness, but now she stopped and stared at one particular piece of paper with an expression of growing excitement. "Caleb, look at this witness signature on the lease agreement. Thomas J. Harrison, Notary Public." Tom's father, Caleb realized. He was involved in the original transactions. Which means Tom might know more about this situation than he's let on, Sarah continued. His father witnessed documents that were probably fraudulent. That's the kind of family secret that gets passed down through generations. 1 year later, the cabin stood complete against the autumn mountainside, its weathered logs glowing golden in the late afternoon Sunday. The structure looked as if it had always been there, as if Samuel's careful planning and Caleb's patient restoration had simply awakened something that the land had been waiting to express. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of seasoned oak and the promise of warmth within. Caleb emerged from the cabin carrying a hand-forged iron key, its weight substantial in his palm. The key represented more than access to a building. It symbolized home, belonging, and the completion of a journey that had transformed both him and everyone who had shared in the work. He turned the key in the lock that he had installed using Samuel's original hardware, the mechanism engaging with the solid click of craftsmanship meant to last generations. Sarah appeared in the doorway behind him, her hair catching the golden light as she stepped onto the porch they had built together using traditional joinery techniques. The documentation project had evolved into something larger than either had imagined, a comprehensive guide to mountain building methods that had attracted interest from universities and conservation organizations across the region. "The photographer from the magazine should be here soon," she said, settling beside him on the hand-hewn bench that occupied the same spot where Samuel used to sit during evening conversations with his young grandson. "Are you ready for all this attention?" The article in Southern Living magazine would introduce their work to thousands of readers, but the real impact was already evident in the steady stream of visitors who came to learn traditional techniques and understand how old wisdom could address modern challenges. The cabin had become exactly what Samuel had envisioned, a teacher that would preserve knowledge for future generations. Tom's truck appeared through the trees, followed by several other vehicles carrying the small group of friends and neighbors who had supported the project through its most difficult moments. The legal battle with Pinnacle Development had ended 6 months earlier when the company abandoned their purchase plans rather than face a prolonged court case over fraudulent lease agreements. The victory had been satisfying, but the real triumph was evident in the life that had grown up around the restored cabin. Sarah had moved her environmental consulting practice to the mountain, working from an office they had built in the cabin's loft, using the same traditional methods as the main structure. Caleb had discovered that his skills as a traditional craftsman were in high demand among people who valued quality over speed, permanence over convenience. But the greatest change was the new family portrait that now sat on the mantelpiece beside Samuel's compass and Margaret's photograph. The image captured Caleb, Sarah, and Tom standing together in front of the completed cabin, their faces reflecting the satisfaction of work well done and relationships built on shared values. The cabin had taught them that some things were worth preserving, that patient effort could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that the best inheritance wasn't money or property, but the knowledge of how to build something lasting with your own hands. Samuel's dream of creating a place where traditional wisdom could survive and flourish had been realized, not through isolation, but through community, not through resistance to change, but through the careful integration of old knowledge with new understanding. As evening approached and their guests gathered for the celebration, Caleb understood that the restoration was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The cabin would continue teaching, the knowledge would continue spreading, and the mountains would continue calling to those who understood that some things mattered more than progress, more than profit, more than the temporary fashions of any particular age.